We think we know the Vikings, horned helmets, dragon ships, warriors charging across windswept fields. But there's a darker story written in Irish chronicles and Swedish graves. Women torn from burning villages while their bellies swelled with new life. Children born in shackles. Bodies that vanished from history itself. What happened to pregnant women after Viking conquest? Why are their graves empty when they should be full? And what do the few traces they left behind tell us about a brutality so complete it nearly erased itself? If you value documented Viking and Norse era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Dr. Marianne Hem Eriksson's groundbreaking study published in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal in May 2025, and Ben Raffield's comprehensive analysis of Viking slave markets from Uppsala University's Viking Phenomenon Project, both representing the deepest archaeological research into this hidden aspect of Viking society. Now back to the information. 821. Howth, Ireland. The Annals of Ulster record it with brutal clarity. Etar was plundered by the heathens, and they carried off a great number of women into captivity. Not gold, not silver, women. But the chronicle doesn't tell you what happened next. It doesn't mention the ones whose bodies had already begun to round, the ones who couldn't run as fast, the ones who gave birth in Viking longships while waves crashed over foreign waters. Researchers now estimate that slaves comprised up to 25% of Scandinavia's population during the Viking Age. DNA analysis of modern Iceland reveals that 2/3 of the island's female founding population had Gaelic origins, Irish or Scottish, while only 1/3 had Nordic roots. These weren't love stories, these were kidnapping statistics written in genes. The Vikings called their slaves thralls. The poems list their names: noisy, stout, sticky, bedmate, bad breath, stumpy, fatty. The women: stumpina, dumpy, bulging calves, shouty, bondwoman, craneshanks, children of rape, given names that meant nothing. But the worst name wasn't on that list. It was the one unspoken, the children who were born into slavery because their enslaved mothers had been impregnated by free men who declined to acknowledge them. Archaeological evidence tells a story the sagas won't. Anna Kjellström of Stockholm University examined skeletal remains from suspected Viking-era slave graves across Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The bones showed signs of abuse, decapitation, bodies buried without grave goods next to their masters. Women were used as sex slaves, and any children who resulted could either be considered the master's children or treated as slaves themselves. But pregnancy created a unique vulnerability. Recent research published in May 2025 reveals that in Viking legal texts, pregnancy in enslaved women was viewed as a defect when they were being sold. Think about that. A pregnant slave was damaged goods, worth less. Children born to subordinate populations were considered the property of their owners. Before they drew their first breath, they were already someone else's possession. Despite high estimated rates of obstetric death during the Viking Age, potential mother-infant burials are exceptionally rare among thousands of excavated sites. The absence is deafening. Only 14 possible mother-infant burials have been identified from the entire Viking Age. Where are the bodies? Infants are generally underrepresented in Viking Age burials, with some appearing in domestic contexts, leaving the fate and burial practices for many newborns largely unknown. Some were found beneath house floors, others simply disappeared from the archaeological record entirely. In one grave from Fjälkinge, Sweden, an adult woman was buried with a newborn placed between her thighs, but the woman's legs had been weighed down by a boulder. Even in death, she was being held down. The scale was massive. The Annals of Ulster record a great booty of women taken in a raid near Dublin in 821, while the same account contends that 3,000 people were captured in a single attack a century later. In 870, Vikings transported a vast prey of British, Pictish, and English captives back to Ireland after the fall of Alt-Clut. Thousands of women, hundreds would have been pregnant. Where did they go? Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan encountered a group of Rus slavers and a number of female captives on the Volga River in 922. Ibn Haukal wrote in 977 of a Viking slave trade that extended across the Mediterranean from Spain to Egypt. Pregnant Irish women gave birth in markets from Russia to North Africa. Their children grew up speaking Arabic, Slavonic, Byzantine Greek, never knowing the green hills their mothers remembered. One documented case from 1043 tells of a pregnant thrall woman accused of theft. When a local nobleman's son defended her, 3 men killed them both with arrows. That woman became part of a saint's story. Most didn't even get names. The archaeological evidence grows more disturbing. At Swedish sites like Sanda, Archaeologists found great halls surrounded by small structures, possible slave quarters that researchers describe as the big house on a plantation. Round huts dug into the ground sit on slopes above manor houses. The huts appear to have been living quarters for slaves at the height of Viking prosperity. About 1 in 25 male Viking burials in Sweden and Norway includes teeth incised with deep grooves. At least some of these men were decapitated and placed in burial with another man. Ritual sacrifice. It is assumed that such persons were grave gifts and would follow their masters in death. If they killed the men, what did they do to the pregnant women? The need for slaves may have begun during the earlier Vendel era, when the fast-growing fleet of ships demanded enormous numbers of massive woolen sails. A single 90-square-meter sail might take a single person up to 5 years to produce. Each ship needed 2 sails. And there were hundreds of ships. Textile working in Scandinavia was strongly associated with women. Pregnant captives weren't just sexual slaves. They were factory workers whose children would inherit their chains. Historical sources describe captives being held within fortified raiding bases. In 882, a Viking force at Asselt took captive a number of people who had entered their camp to trade. Frankish chronicler Adrevald described shackled captives being held in huts within an encampment, pregnant women giving birth in wooden cages while their captors planned the next raid. The taking of women and children is highlighted in several contemporary sources, including accounts not only of the raid on Seville in 844, but also those on Etarharsh, Ireland, in 821, and Walcheren, Frisia, in 837. In 873, at Macht, the Annals of Fulda record a Viking leader threatening to take captive the women and children of the local population if they did not provide tribute. Pregnancy made women slower, easier to catch, more valuable in certain markets, but some fought back. The saga of Freydis Eriksdottir tells of a pregnant woman caught in an attack by indigenous peoples of Greenland. Unable to escape due to her pregnancy, she picked up a sword, bared her breast, and struck the sword against it, scaring the assailants away. This story finds a parallel in the only known convincing depiction of pregnancy from the Viking Age, a silver figurine found in a 10th century woman's burial in Aska, Sweden, depicting a pregnant woman wearing what appears to be a helmet with a nose guard. The figurine was found buried with a rich and varied artifacts assemblage as well as animals. One interpretation is that she was a seeress or ritual specialist. Even pregnant, she was martial. Even vulnerable, she was dangerous, but she was elite, free. The captive women had no silver helmets, no rich burials, no names. The genetic evidence is undeniable. Anthropologist Suna Ebenezer's daughter analyzed genomes of 25 ancient Icelanders whose skeletal remains were found in burial sites across the island. Sequencing using samples from teeth revealed the settlers had a roughly even split of Norse and Gaelic ancestry, but the pattern is telling. The males buried during that period in a cemetery on the Isle of Man had mainly names of Norse origin, while the females there had names of indigenous origin. Irish and British women are mentioned in old texts on the founding of Iceland, indicating that the Viking explorers were accompanied there by women from the British Isles, who either came along voluntarily or were taken along by force. Voluntary, what a word. As if a pregnant woman captured in a raid had choices. By 950, it is conservatively estimated, 15% of the population of Western Europe were slaves. Limerick and Dublin wouldn't have become such strong economic hubs otherwise. Entire cities built on the trade in human flesh, pregnant women sold like livestock, children born in markets, weighed and priced before they could walk. Most archaeological material only indirectly reflects the presence of the enslaved. They would have needed housing and feeding, and their work must have been not only integrated into the economy, but perhaps also a main driver of it. In the early Viking Age, who serviced the rapid expansion of the labor-intensive tar production industry? Later in the period, who handled the escalating need for sailcloth and therefore woolen sheep? The answer was in the bellies of captured women. Future workers, future slaves, future ghosts. The thing about studying slavery and captivity is that these groups are often described in the archaeological literature as invisible or unseen. Their movements are curtailed. They're denied of possessions. They're not always accorded formal habitation, places to sleep, places to live. They're really hard to identify in the archaeological record. But the most damning evidence comes from the legal codes themselves. The Norse system of thraldom was not always complete chattel slavery, but most of the enslaved had little agency. The slave could own nothing, inherit nothing, leave nothing. Some thralls were born into slavery because both of their parents were enslaved. or a freeborn man who had impregnated their enslaved mother declined to acknowledge the child. Behind every Viking raid was the appalling trauma visited upon all people at the moment of enslavement, the disbelieving experience of passing from person to property in seconds. For pregnant women, it was worse. They passed from person to property while another person grew inside them. Someone who would be born a slave, someone who would never know freedom. The chronicles record the raids, the DNA records the children, but the graves are empty. Researchers suggest that pregnant women who died weren't routinely buried with their unborn child and may not have been commemorated as one mark, symbiotic unity by Viking societies. Newborns were found buried with adult men and postmenopausal women, assemblages which may be family graves, but they may also be something else altogether. 821, Howth, Ireland. A great number of women carried off into captivity. Some were pregnant. Their children grew up in Scandinavia, speaking Norse, working Viking farms, wearing Viking clothes, never knowing their mothers had Irish names, never knowing their mothers had fought, never knowing their mothers had died far from home, in foreign soil, with no one to remember their real names. As Dr. Marianne Hem Erickson notes, pregnancy was deeply political and far from uniform in meaning for Viking Age communities. It shaped, and was shaped by, ideas of social status, kinship, and personhood. For free women, pregnancy meant power, lineage, future. For enslaved women, it meant double captivity, 2 lives owned by someone else. In 2024, archaeologists digging near Stockholm found what they initially thought was a typical Viking Age settlement. Then they noticed the pattern: large houses surrounded by smaller structures, cooking areas separated from sleeping areas, work areas designed for textile production. They had found something that hadn't been properly identified before: a Viking plantation. What you likely have is a slave-driven production of textiles. We can't really know who was making the cloth, but the implications are clear. The cloth was made by the children of Howth, the children of 821, the children whose mothers had been dragged to longships while Irish villages burned behind them, children born in captivity, raised in captivity, who died in captivity so complete that even death couldn't free them. Their graves are unmarked, their names forgotten. Their blood flows in the veins of modern Scandinavians who will never know the terror that brought their ancestors north. The transport routes tell their own horror story. Viking slave ships were designed for cargo, not comfort. Ahmad ibn Fadlan witnessed female captives chained in the holds of Rus vessels on the Volga, pregnant women giving birth in darkness while the ship rocked through Baltic storms. No midwives, no clean water. Children born into a world where their first breath was the stench of human misery. Archaeological evidence from Dublin shows the scale. Iron shackles found near the harbor, slave collars discovered in trading quarters. The long fort established in 841 became a processing center for human cargo. Pregnant women were sorted by condition. Those near birth were kept for local use. Those months away were prepared for longer journeys. Market efficiency applied to human flesh. The Frankish chronicler Adrevald described Viking encampments with wooden cages holding captives, but he doesn't mention the special arrangements for pregnant women. Recent excavations at Asselt reveal post holes suggesting structures built specifically for housing female captives long term. Maternity wards for slaves, places where Irish women gave birth to children who would be sold before they could speak their first words. Strontium isotope analysis of teeth from suspected slave burials reveals the extent of geographic displacement. Women who grew up drinking Irish water died with Norwegian soil beneath their feet. Their children's teeth show different isotope signatures, evidence of forced migration before age 5. Babies torn from mothers and sold to distant farms. The isotope data creates a map of trauma written in bone chemistry. The economic calculations were brutal. A pregnant slave represented future inventory. Viking law codes specified penalties for damaging pregnant thralls, not to protect the women, but to protect the investment. One legal text from Iceland states that injuring a pregnant slave woman required compensation equal to half the value of the expected child. The fetus had a price before it had a heartbeat. In Hedeby, one of the largest Viking Age trading centers, archaeologists found evidence of specialized slave quarters near the harbor. Stone foundations suggest buildings designed to house hundreds of people temporarily, transit camps for human cargo. Analysis of cooking areas reveals large-scale food preparation, institutional feeding for mass captivity. Pregnant women waited here while buyers assessed their condition and calculated delivery dates. The genetic evidence grows more specific with each study. Mitochondrial DNA analysis shows that many Scandinavian lineages trace back to Celtic women in the 9th and 10th centuries, but Y chromosome analysis reveals a different pattern. The male lines remain predominantly Norse. This isn't gradual cultural mixing. This is systematic replacement of one population's women with another's, reproductive conquest on a genetic level. Archaeological remains from Birka, Sweden's major Viking Age trading hub, include what researchers now identify as slave processing facilities. Buildings with multiple small rooms, each with a single entrance that could be locked from outside, birthing chambers for enslaved women, places where pregnancy became another form of captivity, women who escaped one cage only to find themselves locked in their own bodies. The Annals of Fulda record a particularly revealing incident from 873. A Viking leader threatened local Frisians, provide tribute, or we will take captive the women and children. Note the specificity, not just people, women and children, the reproductive future of the population. Viking strategy understood that controlling pregnancy meant controlling the future. Evidence from Seville provides another glimpse. When Vikings took the city in 844, they specifically targeted the royal family's women. The Emir of Cordoba paid ransoms to get them back, but common women weren't worth ransoming. They disappeared into the slave networks, their pregnancies becoming assets in Scandinavian markets. Royal wombs had value. Peasant wombs were just inventory. The treatment varied by pregnancy stage. Early pregnancy meant higher transport value. The woman could work during the journey and give birth after sale. Late pregnancy meant local use or immediate sale to minimize transport risk. Miscarriage during transport was pure loss. Successful birth meant doubling the human inventory. Viking logistics applied to human reproduction. Isotope analysis of infant remains found in Scandinavian domestic contexts reveals disturbing patterns. Some show birth isotope signatures matching known slave source regions, but rapid shifts suggesting forced dietary changes. Evidence of children separated from mothers immediately after birth. Wet nurses from the slave population feeding masters' children while their own babies were sold separately. The legal codes preserve more horror. Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code reflecting Viking Age practices, specifies that children born to slave women belong to the mother's owner. But if the father was free and acknowledged the child, complex negotiations determined ownership. Pregnant slave women became pawns in legal battles over unborn children. Their bodies were contested territory. Excavations at Woodstown, Ireland, reveal a Viking long fort with evidence of long-term captive holding, cooking facilities sized for hundreds, sleeping areas with no personal belongings, latrine systems suggesting institutional waste management. This wasn't a temporary raid base. This was a slave processing center. Pregnant Irish women spent months here while their captors organized transport to Scandinavian markets. The seasonal patterns emerged from chronicle analysis. Most raids targeting women occurred in late spring and early summer, optimal timing for pregnancy progression during transport. Women captured in May would give birth in Scandinavian winter, when domestic labor demand peaked. Viking planning incorporated human gestation cycles into raid scheduling. Evidence from Limerick shows the scale of the Irish slave trade. The city became a major export hub for human cargo by 920. Pregnant women formed a substantial portion of this trade. Bills of sale written in Old Norse list pregnant thralls with estimated delivery dates. Human beings reduced to shipping manifests with pregnancy duration noted like cargo weight. The linguistic evidence is equally damning. Old Norse terms for pregnancy in relation to slaves differ from those for free women. Free women were blessed, or with child. Slave women were burdened, or carrying cargo. The language stripped away the humanity of slave pregnancy, reducing it to an economic condition rather than a biological process. Burial evidence from the Orkneys reveals the practice of slave sacrifice at elite funerals, but pregnant slaves presented a dilemma: kill the woman and lose the child, or let her give birth and then execute both. Several burials show pregnant women killed in their final trimester. The fetal remains positioned to suggest they died together. The masters couldn't wait for natural birth to claim their grave goods. Archaeological evidence from the Danelaw in England shows different patterns. Here, Vikings settled permanently, and pregnant slave women became part of established households. Isotope analysis reveals children born to Celtic mothers but raised in Anglo-Scandinavian cultural contexts. These women didn't disappear into distant markets. They became permanent breeding stock in newly established Viking territories. The monastery chronicles provide the most detailed contemporary accounts. The Annals of Saint Bertin describe Vikings taking countless women from raids in Francia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports great slaughter, followed by the capture of many women and children after the Great Heathen Army's campaigns. These weren't random captures. These were systematic population transfers targeting reproductive age women. Recent excavations at York reveal evidence of slave quarters in the Viking settlement, buildings with thick walls, single entrances, and interior divisions suggesting cells, but some divisions show evidence of modifications, wider spaces, better drainage, straw flooring, maternity cells, places where pregnant slaves gave birth under guard, their children immediately removed and assigned to new owners. The trade routes were vast. Evidence from as far as Constantinople shows Scandinavian slaves, including women who gave birth during the journey south. Byzantine records mention northern women sold with their nursing children. These weren't local acquisitions. These were Irish and English women who had traveled thousands of miles, giving birth along the way, their children used as proof of their fertility for future buyers. But the most telling evidence comes from what's missing. Despite extensive excavation of Viking Age sites across Scandinavia, very few burials show women buried with infants in ways suggesting death in childbirth. The expected archaeological signature of high maternal mortality is largely absent. This suggests pregnant slave women who died weren't given formal burial. They were disposed of like any other damaged property. The few documented cases of resistance are remarkable for their rarity. Beyond Freydis with her sword, only scattered references exist to pregnant captives fighting back. One Frankish chronicle mentions a pregnant woman who threw herself from a Viking ship rather than give birth in slavery. Another records a group of pregnant captives who refused to eat. Preferring starvation to delivering children into bondage, the economic records that survive are equally stark. A bill of sale from Hedeby lists a pregnant thrall woman at 2/3 the price of a non-pregnant one of similar age. The pregnancy was valued, but as a risk factor. If the birth went badly, the buyer lost both woman and child. If it went well, they gained 2 slaves for a discounted price. Human reproduction reduced to market calculations. The Viking Age ended gradually, but its genetic legacy persists. Modern Scandinavians carry Celtic maternal lineages that trace directly to the slave trades of the 9th and 10th centuries. DNA studies suggest that in some regions of Norway and Sweden, up to 40% of female lineages derive from Celtic slaves. The descendants of Howth and Dublin walk the streets of Oslo and Stockholm, unknowing monuments to conquest and captivity. The archaeological evidence continues to emerge. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of known Viking Age sites now specifically search for evidence of slave quarters and burial grounds. Recent discoveries in Denmark revealed a mass grave containing remains that isotope analysis links to the British Isles. Men, women, and children buried together without grave goods, possibly captives who died during processing, disposed of in unmarked pits. The empty graves tell the real story, not the sagas of heroes and gods, not the romanticized tales of exploration and adventure. The story of women erased so completely that modern archaeology struggles to prove they existed at all. The story of children born into slavery so total it consumed not just their lives, but their deaths, their burials, their very presence in the historical record. In 2024, construction workers digging foundations near Bergen uncovered what archaeologists now identify as a slave birth center. Stone-lined rooms with drainage channels, evidence of regular cleaning with sand and seawater. Birthing chairs carved from single blocks of stone. This wasn't a medical facility, this was a factory, a place where pregnancy became production, where women became machines for creating new slaves. They carried off a great number of women into captivity. The ones who survived gave birth to a new people. The ones who didn't were buried in unmarked ground, their children scattered to masters who gave them names like Stumpy and Fatty and Bedmate. Their real names died with their mothers. Their stories vanished into the North Sea wind. Only their DNA remains, writing in blood the truth the sagas wouldn't tell. Viking expansion wasn't just about conquest, it was about replacement, the systematic erasure of entire bloodlines, entire peoples, entire ways of life. And it started with pregnant women who couldn't run fast enough when the dragon ships appeared on the horizon.